The most dangerous loss is not when someone leaves you. It's when you finally realize what you lost after they're gone. Comfort kills appreciation in the most silent, invisible way. It doesn't arrive like heartbreak or betrayal. It arrives slowly, disguised as safety, routine, and familiarity. When someone shows up every day, prioritizes you without being asked, forgives without keeping score, and remains steady through your emotional fluctuations, the human mind begins to normalize that presence. What once felt rare starts to feel guaranteed. What once felt special starts to feel expected. Effort turns into duty. Sacrifice turns into assumption. And love, which once created butterflies, slowly becomes background noise, not because it lost its value, but because the human brain adapts quickly to emotional security. The danger of comfort is that it removes urgency. It creates the illusion that nothing needs to be protected because nothing feels at risk. You stop saying thank you for the things that once moved your soul. You stop noticing the small acts of devotion because they happen so consistently that they feel automatic. You start focusing more on what's missing than on what's present. The warmth that once felt like magic now feels ordinary, and ordinary begins to feel boring. That is where appreciation quietly dies, because appreciation is born from awareness, and comfort numbs awareness. The heart stops being curious about what it has because it assumes what it has will always remain. And slowly, without any dramatic conflict, gratitude is replaced by entitlement. Once entitlement enters a connection, emotional blindness follows. You begin to believe that the person who stayed through your worst days will continue staying no matter how careless you become with their heart. You start expressing less, valuing less, listening less. Their patience feels endless. Their loyalty feels unconditional. Their emotional availability feels like a permanent resource instead of a gift. And when someone feels like a permanent resource, the urgency to protect them disappears. You stop choosing them intentionally and start choosing them out of habit. You test boundaries without realizing you are training the other person to feel invisible. You delay affection. You withhold softness. You assume tomorrow will fix what you neglected today. But comfort does not deepen love by itself. Love deepens when presence is paired with gratitude. Without gratitude, presence turns into emotional furniture, useful, reliable, but unseen. And when a person feels unseen for long enough, their giving becomes heavy, their waiting becomes tiring, their loyalty begins to hurt. Yet the one living in comfort rarely notices the shift in energy because comfort dulls emotional sensitivity. By the time appreciation tries to return, it often arrives late, after silence has replaced effort, after distance has replaced closeness, after routine has replaced connection, when the absence finally awakens the awareness that comfort had put to sleep. Consistency is often mistaken for weakness because the human mind is wired to associate strength with intensity, unpredictability, control, and dominance. Loud confidence is seen as power. Emotional restraint is misread as lack of depth. When someone remains steady instead of reactive, calm instead of explosive, loyal instead of manipulative, their strength becomes invisible to those who are addicted to chaos. Consistency does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It shows up quietly every day without drama. It holds space during emotional storms instead of creating them. It chooses stability when ego wants to win. And because it does not shake the ground when it moves, it is often assumed to be fragile. People begin to believe that someone who does not leave at the first threat is afraid to leave. Someone who forgives repeatedly is assumed to lack boundaries. Someone who stays calm during conflict is assumed to be emotionally dependent. The truth is, consistency requires enormous internal power, but that power is subtle, not performative. It does not intimidate. It reassures. And in a world that confuses emotional volatility with passion, reassurance is undervalued. When a person is consistent, they offer emotional safety without conditions. They respond instead of reacting. They choose understanding over dominance. They stay through fluctuations instead of turning love into leverage. But consistency makes people comfortable, and comfort creates false assumptions. The one receiving it begins to believe that this stability exists because the consistent person has no other options, no leverage, no self-respect strong enough to walk away. Their patience is misinterpreted as tolerance for neglect. Their loyalty is misread as fear of abandonment. Their emotional regulation is seen as emotional weakness. So the boundaries are pushed further. Delays become longer. Effort becomes optional. Respect becomes negotiable. The consistent person absorbs the imbalance quietly at first, not because they are weak, but because they are self-controlled. They assess, they observe, they adjust. And the one benefiting from that steadiness assumes that control equals dependency. What they fail to understand is that restraint is not helplessness. Silence is not surrender. Stillness is not submission. The consistent person often sees more, feels deeper, and calculates longer than anyone realizes. Their strength simply does not look like aggression. Over time, this misinterpretation reshapes power dynamics. The emotionally loud one feels superior. The emotionally steady one is seen as inferior. The one who threatens to leave is perceived as strong. The one who remains grounded is perceived as disposable. And the tragedy is that the relationship begins to orbit around the volatility instead of the stability. Drama becomes the language of value. Withdrawal becomes the tool of control. Meanwhile, consistency continues doing what it always does, showing up, holding space, absorbing tension, choosing connection over ego. But nothing sustained by imbalance remains stable forever, because eventually even the strongest restraint reaches capacity. Even the quietest patience feels the weight of being misunderstood. And when consistency finally shifts into distance, it does not erupt. It does not warn repeatedly. It simply stops offering what was once endlessly available. And the shock that follows does not come from the departure itself. It comes from the delayed realization that the one who seemed weakest was actually the emotional anchor holding everything together. And once that anchor lifts, the drift feels sudden, silent, and uncontrollable. Ego blocks realization by creating a protective blindfold over the mind, a layer of false certainty that convinces a person they are always right, always justified, always the victim, always the one who was wronged rather than the one who caused the damage. It resists uncomfortable truths because admitting fault feels like humiliation to the ego, not growth. The ego does not seek understanding. It seeks victory. It would rather preserve pride than preserve connection. It would rather rewrite memories than confront responsibility. When mistakes happen, the ego rushes to assign blame outward, constructing stories that protect self-image at all costs. It magnifies the other person's flaws and minimizes its own. It remembers only the moments where it felt hurt, never the moments where it hurt others. And in doing so, it delays awareness, sometimes for years. Realization requires vulnerability. It requires the courage to say, I was wrong, and the ego interprets that sentence as weakness. So instead, it builds defenses out of excuses, out of narratives that justify neglect, emotional distance, selfish choices, and the slow erosion of empathy. The ego convinces the mind that loss was inevitable, that distance was mutual, that collapse happened on its own, never as a result of one-sided emotional negligence. When ego dominates, it reshapes perception itself. A person does not see abandonment as abandonment if it inconveniences their self-image. They see it as self-respect. They do not see coldness as coldness. They see it as boundaries. They do not see emotional withdrawal as cruelty. They see it as strength. And anyone who asks for accountability is labeled controlling, insecure, or dramatic. Ego reframes abandonment as empowerment, silence as dignity, and emotional detachment as growth, not because these labels are accurate, but because they soothe guilt. It delays the discomfort of self-reflection by converting every consequence into a virtue. The problem is not that the ego lies loudly, it lies convincingly. It narrates reality in a tone that feels justified, logical, and morally superior. And as long as that narrative remains intact, realization has no space to enter. The mind becomes locked in a version of reality where the self is always reasonable and the other is always excessive. Emotional injuries become invisible. Broken trust becomes forgotten. Unmet needs become irrelevant. And the longer this illusion is maintained, the further awareness is pushed into the future. The shift toward realization only begins when ego protection fails, when the distractions run out, when the external validations no longer drown out the internal discomfort. It often arrives in quiet moments when no audience is left to perform strength for, when distractions stop working, when loneliness cannot be reframed as independence. The same ego that once inflated confidence begins to crack under unanswered questions. Why does absence still hurt if nothing was wrong? Why does silence feel loud if detachment was growth? Why does replacement not erase memory? Why does distraction not kill longing? And in those moments, realization tries to surface, but ego fights it one last time, producing delayed regrets, revised timelines, selective memory, emotional bargaining with the past, attempts to reach backward without having fully looked inward, the mind oscillating between self-defense and dawning awareness, the heart beginning to sense that the cost of maintaining pride may have quietly outweighed the cost of admitting truth. Absence exposes emotional dependency in a way that presence never can, because when someone is there, the mind confuses support with self-sufficiency and connection with independence. As long as the messages arrive, the calls continue, the reassurance remains available, and the emotional weight is being shared, the illusion of strength stays intact. It feels like control. It feels like choice. It feels like freedom. But when that presence disappears, when the routine of emotional regulation collapses, when there is no longer a familiar voice stabilizing the nervous system, the truth surfaces with sharp clarity. The thoughts become louder, the nights become longer. The emotions that were once processed externally now have no outlet. Anxiety that was once softened by reassurance now expands without resistance. And in that quiet, the realization forms that what felt like love may have also been emotional reliance. The heart begins to crave the energy it once leaned on. The mind begins to search for the comfort it once outsourced. Suddenly, strength feels fragile because it was never fully internal. What once felt like independence now feels like withdrawal. What once felt like choice now feels like loss. Absence removes the emotional scaffolding that quietly held everything upright. When emotional dependency has been present, it often hides beneath confidence for a long time. A person may function well in the world, appear composed, socially connected, and even self-assured, yet still rely deeply on one emotional anchor for regulation, validation, and identity stability. That reliance does not always feel needy while it is being met. It feels normal. It feels mutual. It feels balanced. The dependency only becomes visible when the source of emotional grounding is no longer there to absorb the weight. Then the internal world begins to destabilize. Small problems feel overwhelming. Silence feels unbearable. Decision-making feels heavier. Emotions feel harder to manage alone. The absence exposes how much emotional labor had quietly been carried by the other person. It reveals how much inner calm was externally supported. And because this support was consistent, it was never labeled as dependence. It was simply experienced as life. The dependency was not dramatic. It was subtle. It lived in the sharing of fears, the emotional reassurance after conflict, the comfort during insecurity, the grounding during uncertainty. Its exposure feels shocking because the mind believed it was standing on its own the entire time. Once the absence reveals this dependency, the emotional reaction often becomes confused and contradictory. Pride resists the truth while longing confirms it. The mind says, I don't need them, while the nervous system reacts as if something essential is missing. The body remembers patterns before the ego accepts them. Triggers appear in ordinary moments. Songs, places, times of day, emotional states that were once regulated through connection now become points of emotional vulnerability. The urge to reach out is not always about loving the person. It is often about craving the emotional equilibrium they once created. And this is where discomfort intensifies, because the dependency is not just on the person, but on the emotional version of the self that existed when they were present. Without that mirror, identity feels disoriented. The absence forces confrontation with the parts of the self that were quietly being carried by someone else, the fears that were softened by reassurance, the doubts that were stabilized by support, the emotional fluctuations that were moderated through attachment. And as the realization deepens, the conflict grows between wanting independence and mourning how dependent the nervous system had unconsciously become. Regret grows when replacement fails because the human mind often believes that loss can be neutralized by substitution, that emotional depth can be exchanged the way options are exchanged, that connection is transferable as long as a new presence fills the physical space left behind. At first, replacement feels like proof of power. It feels like control over attachment. It feels like validation that nothing meaningful was lost. The mind convinces itself that moving on quickly is strength, that distraction is healing, that novelty is progress. The early stages of replacement carry excitement, attention, unpredictability, and the illusion of starting fresh without consequence. The new energy feels lighter because it has not yet been tested by conflict, responsibility, history, or emotional fatigue. And in that lightness, the past feels smaller. The mind misinterprets this temporary emotional high as evidence that the previous bond was never that deep. But replacement only masks grief. It does not erase it. It postpones confrontation with loss by covering it with stimulation. And once the stimulation fades, what remains is comparison. Quiet, involuntary, relentless comparison. As the replacement settles into routine, the contrasts begin to surface. The things once taken for granted begin to appear through the lens of absence. The consistency that once felt boring now feels rare. The patience that once felt predictable now feels protective. The stability that once felt ordinary now feels grounding. And suddenly the mind that once dismissed the past begins to reevaluate it. But regret does not arrive as one clear realization. It grows in fragments. It grows in moments where expectations go unmet. It grows when emotional warmth feels shallow. It grows when conflict does not feel safe. It grows when vulnerability is not met with the same depth of care. Replacement fails not because the new person is flawed, but because the emotional architecture is different. The body remembers what it learned to feel secure with. The nervous system remembers the rhythm of safety. And when that rhythm is absent, no amount of novelty can replicate the emotional familiarity that once regulated the heart. Regret deepens further when the mind begins to realize that what was lost cannot be recreated with someone new. The laughter sounds different. The understanding feels partial. The emotional language does not translate the same way. Inside jokes no longer land with the same weight. Silence no longer feels as safe. And this is where the quiet panic begins. Not dramatic, not visible, but internal. The person starts wondering whether they overestimated what could be replaced and underestimated what was rare. They start revisiting memories with a different emotional filter. Moments once dismissed as insignificant become charged with meaning. Sacrifices once overlooked become heavy with weight. The mind begins to replay conversations with revised understanding. Words that once felt ordinary now feel loaded. Chances once taken lightly now feel irreversible. And while the outer world may see progression, strength, and moving on, the inner world begins to experience emotional regression, drifting backward into unresolved attachment. As replacement continues to fail emotionally, the ego fights the rising regret. It resists the idea that a mistake was made. It reframes dissatisfaction as restlessness. It reframes longing as boredom. It reframes comparison as curiosity. But the body responds differently. The body tightens during late night silence. The heart feels heavier in moments that should feel light. The absence becomes most visible when the new presence cannot absorb the emotional weight that the old one once carried effortlessly. And this is where the most painful layer of regret forms, not just missing the person, but missing the emotional version of the self that existed when that person was present, the safety, the softness, the emotional ease that now feels unreachable through substitution alone. Healing begins with responsibility, not blame, because blame keeps the mind trapped in a story where pain is always caused by someone else and therefore never truly understood within the self. Blame feels easier than accountability because it protects identity from discomfort. It allows a person to remain morally superior in their own narrative while silently postponing growth. When pain is assigned entirely to another person, the question of how one contributed, tolerated, enabled, ignored, or repeated patterns never has to be asked. Blame keeps the wound alive, but relocates its origin outside the self, which gives temporary emotional relief, but permanent emotional stagnation. Responsibility, on the other hand, feels threatening because it demands self-examination. It asks uncomfortable questions without offering immediate emotional comfort. It forces the mind to revisit choices that were once emotionally justified. It breaks the illusion that everything happened to you and introduces the possibility that some things also happened through you. And it is precisely this shift that activates real healing, because healing cannot occur in a psyche that insists on being innocent of all emotional causation. When a person avoids responsibility, they often confuse self-protection with self-growth. They believe that refusing accountability means refusing self-attack. But responsibility is not self-punishment. It is not about drowning in guilt or shame. It is about recognizing the role one played in the emotional ecosystem of a relationship, a pattern, a decision, a collapse. It is about becoming aware of how boundaries were expressed or not expressed, how needs were communicated or suppressed, how red flags were rationalized, how intuition was overridden by hope, how attachment shaped behavior, how fear shaped silence, how validation shaped compromise. Blame reduces complexity into a single villain. Responsibility expands the narrative to include the full emotional architecture of what actually happened. And while blame creates stagnation through emotional rigidity, responsibility introduces flexibility because where there is awareness, there is also the possibility of change. A person who blames remains fixed in the same emotional posture, waiting for external justice to deliver internal peace. A person who accepts responsibility begins the slow work of rebuilding emotional power from within. The shift from blame to responsibility often begins at the point where emotional repetition becomes impossible to ignore. When the same relationship patterns repeat with different people. When the same emotional wounds manifest in different forms. When the same endings arrive despite different beginnings. This is where the mind is forced to confront the possibility that the common denominator is not always external. Responsibility begins quietly, often with resistance, with defensiveness, with emotional bargaining, with the initial attempt to take partial accountability without fully surrendering the protection of blame. But as awareness deepens, the emotional language changes. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" the question becomes, "Why did I stay when I felt unsafe? Why did I accept what I knew was misaligned? Why did I silence my needs? Why did I mistake intensity for intimacy? Why did I equate consistency with boredom? Why did I choose familiarity over compatibility?" These questions do not accuse. They reveal, they do not shame, they illuminate, and as they illuminate, the emotional fog begins to thin. The nervous system begins to recognize its own patterns. The heart begins to understand its own attachments. The mind begins to map the territory of its own choices. And with that mapping comes the first real sensation of agency returning, not through control of others, but through awareness of the self.